Hello and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. First, a word about our upcoming episodes. On Tuesday, September 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll talk with Guido Preparata. Guido is an Italian-American economist who lives in Umbria, Italy. He's a very diverse, outside-the-box thinker who has a PhD in political economy from USC and a master's in criminology from Cambridge University. He taught political economy at the University of Washington and was a Fulbright scholar studying Middle Eastern international relations at the University of Amman in Jordan. Guido was one of the first of the current generation of scholars to write on the subject of Silvio Gesell, including a controversial paper in which he accused Keynes of plagiarizing Gesell's work. And then on Tuesday, October 7th at 1 o'clock, we'll be joined by Nicolas Franke. Nicolas is a Belgian economist who explores the intersections of ecology, economy, and society, and how money can become a tool for resilience and transition. Actively involved in cooperatives, he advocates for participatory democracy and collective intelligence as drivers of transformation. Nicolas is the founder of the Monetary Diversity Network, an organization dedicated to promoting alternative monetary systems and models. As a reminder, Economy 2.0 is meant to be a conversation, not just between me and our invited guest, but also including the live audience joining us on Zoom. These meetings are open to the public. You can read about upcoming episodes and sign up to join us live on the Henry George School website at hgsss.org. Anyone in the audience is welcome to join the conversation at any time. To do so, please use the raise hand button, which can be found under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. And so everyone is aware, these sessions are recorded and will be shared on the YouTube channels of both the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. Also, we would greatly appreciate your support with growing the show. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos. And if you'd like to make a donation, you can do so at silviogesell.com/donate. We'll put a link in the description of the YouTube video. All right, let me bring in today's guest. Felix Fuders joins us from Valdivia, Chile, where he is the director of the Economics Institute and the head of the Right Livelihood College at the Universidad Austral de Chile. He's also the chairman of the Natural Economic Order Foundation in Frankfurt, which is the principal organization in Germany dedicated to promoting the ideas of Silvio Gesell. Felix speaks and writes in at least 3 different languages, including German, Spanish, and English, and is the author of many books and articles. His book, How to Fulfill the UN Sustainability Goals, Rethinking the Role and Concept of Money in the Light of Sustainability, in which he argues that our flawed form of money is the primary cause of our unsustainable pursuit of growth, and that a sustainable future is not possible without a complete overhaul of our monetary system along the lines proposed by Silvio Gesell. I first made contact with Felix about 4 or 5 years ago. As I've spoken about before, I became aware of Silvio Gesell in 2007 and spent more than a decade trying to find anyone in the field of academic economics who could help me understand why Gesell's ideas aren't more widely known. His ideas made complete sense to me, but I couldn't reconcile that with the fact that almost no one knew about him. It didn't seem possible that his analysis could be correct, but that so few people knew of his existence. For many years, I assumed that there must be some flaw in his analysis that I wasn't seeing, and I wanted to find someone who could point the flaw out to me. I found a few mainstream economists who discussed Gesell, such as Greg Mankiw, Willem Bouter, and Miles Kimball, but none of them went into much depth in terms of analyzing and evaluating Gesell's ideas. I was stumped by this situation for many years, and then in the year 2020, I got in touch with Felix. Felix was the first credentialed academic economist I found who had engaged with Gesell's work in depth. Fortunately, he was also very generous with his time, and we began a correspondence which has blossomed into a fruitful collaboration on a variety of projects that continues until today. So Felix, hopefully my fire alarm will stop going off momentarily. Welcome to Economy 2.0. Maybe you could start us off by telling us about your background and professional history. In particular, how and why you found your way to the ideas of Silvio Gesell. You've mentioned to me before that you became aware of Gesell in the same year that I did, 2007. So what were you working on prior to then, and how has learning about Gesell's ideas informed your work since then?
Well, in 2007, I had just finished my PhD and I was looking for what I was going to do next, working in some business um, or working in a university. And I had a friend who was a plumber and he talked about me about Gesell. I haven't didn't hear of Gesell before. And I couldn't really understand the problem inherent in money. He told me there's a problem in money and it's the interest rate. And I said, as an economist, why should it make a difference if I rent a machine or rent money? And he said, I don't know really to explain it, but there's a difference. But you're an economist, you should know. And then I started to think about it. And actually, I had passed through a very difficult time some years ago in 2001, 2002, when I was very sick and no doctor, no physician could help me. And finally, I had the understanding that if a young person is ill, that is because something unnatural in his environment, something in his lifestyle has to be wrong. And I was checking my life and I thought everything's fine. But then I found, well, the only unnatural thing I had it was my teeth. I had gold fillings. And then I started to Google about that. Didn't find a lot, but I thought to myself, it's not really natural to have gold fillings. Many people have them. They don't, doesn't matter them to them, but that doesn't mean that it is healthy. So I took the decision to change my gold inlays with ceramic ones, um, and could regain my health. So I came to the idea that anything that deviates from nature could be unhealthy. And then I understood that our monetary system is completely unnatural. Even Aristotle had already talked about that, and he found our monetary system to be unnatural. Then I found other authors like Frederick Soddy, who is a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, but then wrote 3 books on the role of money. And in these 3 books, he talks about how unnatural is our monetary system. And this is why I got this is how I connected. Well, I got really interested in this money thing. I thought, yes, our monetary system is unnatural. The thing that money reproduces by itself with interest, this is really unnatural. So it cannot be healthy. So then this gives me the incentive to investigate more in it. I read a lots of books. I read theories, and well, I started to philosophize myself on it, write down my first ideas. These were my first articles. And then in 2003, the book you mentioned, How to Fulfill the UN Sustainability Goals, Rethinking the Role and Concept of Money in the Light of Sustainability. Because I'm convinced that we cannot have real We cannot achieve real sustainability without changing our monetary system. And many other problems of our economies, especially inequality, unemployment, and inflation, and financial crisis, they're also all connected to our unnatural financial system.
Yeah, so why don't we start there? I I am familiar with your analysis of money as it relates to sustainability. I'm familiar with your book, but this is an aspect of Gesell's analysis that, as far as I know, Gesell never spoke about himself. I don't. I guess that sustainability was simply not a high priority at the time that he was thinking and writing, and so he didn't. Perhaps he didn't consider, or perhaps he didn't view as important the connection between the monetary system and what you refer to as the growth imperative. So for the benefit of our audience, I believe you have a brief presentation outlining how you view the monetary system as being at the root of our unnatural and unsustainable pursuit of growth. Can you go into that for us?
Yes, of course. So if we change our monetary system, then I believe we can truly achieve what we could call a fair economy, a fair economy. If we take a look at any newspaper in any country, two major problems frequently are addressed. This is income inequality and the increasing destruction of our natural environment. In 2015, more than 190 world leaders committed to 17 sustainability goals. And here too, all but one goals are either linked to the unsustainability in stricto sensu or to inequality, which is generally accepted as an indirect obstacle to sustainability. So many conferences and high-level meetings have been held since then, and one of the major topics regularly is how to finance these goals. However, it is not only more money that is required, but a different kind of money. And also unemployment, inflation are connected to the design of our monetary system, which can be seen as the most important and at the same time least recognized reason for market failure. Money can be described as the blood of our economy. Blood needs to circulate, otherwise the body gets ill. And similar to the blood circulation in the human body, also the economy gets ill if money does not circulate well. But because people tend to preserve what Keynes called the preference for liquidity, we like to save up money. The more, the better. Saving for the future is a natural behavior. Animals display the same behavior. For example, hamsters store food in their cheeks, beers in their belly. However, in nature, it is only possible to hoard goods in a very limited degree, since real goods perish, and any excessive hoarding would, in time, result in the loss of the hoarded goods. This means nature keeps our natural instinct to hoard in check, but our money, as it is designed today, makes it possible to hoard any surplus almost without limit. And our instinctual impulse to hoard is perverted by the fact that our money does not perish and therefore has a special, monopolistic-like position compared to real perishable goods, which creates a strong incentive to produce more than is actually needed. But the unnatural design of our money does not only give a powerful incentive to produce more than is needed for immediate consumption, it even obliges us to do so. And here again, the root cause is the unnatural storability of money. Money stored under the mattress does not circulate well and therefore cannot function as a medium to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. The reason why we do not hoard our money under the mattress, but bring it to a bank, which then lends it out and cause it this, I'm sorry. And then cause it is to to circulate is the interest rate. Interest is the reward for parting with liquidity, creating an incentive to lend money out or to bring it to the bank, which then lends it out for us. If money could not be stored easily and almost without risk, holders of money would be unable to extract interest from borrowers. Seen in this light, interest results from a contradiction between money's two main functions. It is supposed to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, while at the same time it serves as a medium to store value. And to return to the previous metaphor, if money is the blood of the economy, then interest is the drug that makes the blood circulate. The drug is necessary since our money is born with a sort of genetic design flaw and does not circulate well by itself. And as with any drug that is applied for a prolonged period, interest causes significant negative side effects for the health of our economies and people living within, as well as for our natural environment. To understand this, we need to recall the following effect of interest and compound interest. Interest makes deposits and thus the money supply, defined as cash plus deposits, grow. But the money supply does not grow in a linear fashion, but rather according to an exponential function. And this is because any amount deposited in an interest-bearing bank account will have doubled after a certain period. Any amount that doubles at regular intervals grows according to an exponential function, slowly at first, but then faster and faster. And even at low interest rates, compound interest grows exponentially, because eventually the original amount will have doubled too. In the case of a lower interest rate, the flat part of the exponential growth curve is longer, like here the black curve, but at some point the curve will steepen and eventually become almost vertical too. A good way to visualize this effect is the so-called Joseph's penny. If Joseph had bequeathed just 1 cent to his adoptive son Jesus, and if it had been invested at 5% annual interest rate, what would be the value of the bank account today? The answer is 589 billions, not USD or euros, but planet's Earth of pure fine gold. Since there's no interest without debt, money is the counterpart of debt. The money supply and total debt of an economy must grow in a likewise manner. To recall the words of Frederick Soddy, money is a credit-debt relation from which none can effectually escape. The figure here depicts the money supply and total public debt from the US economy. But we can recognize that not only do the money supply and debt grow in tandem, but also that they grow according to an exponential function. And the same exponential growth of money supply and debt can be observed in every country on Earth over a sufficiently long period of time. And actually, the US dollar is really eloquent here. In each dollar bill, we find this sentence: "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." Seems like it is not to buy cars or food, it's to pay debts. Fortunately, not all currencies are so eloquent. We can also now understand why we always see at least some inflation. Meanwhile, the system has not yet crashed. One can intuitively grasp that an exponentially growing money supply must generate inflation, since total production of an economy cannot, in the long run, keep pace with the exponential growth of money supply. And if the amount of money in circulation increases, but the quantity of goods and services remains unchanged, each monetary unit must decline in terms of purchasing power. And this dynamic was described as far back as John Bardeen and David Hume and was formalized into a more modern theory by Irving Fisher. And having now understood the fact that interest rates exert on money supply and total debt, we can now understand the need for constant economic growth in the real economy. It is not only greed that makes us produce more. We are obliged to do so. And there are 4 reasons that contribute to this growth imperative. A steady increase of the total debt means that we all, households, governments, companies, are ever more indebted, and this is the reason why we must continually do more just to remain the status quo. And even a business with no debt is not immune from the growth imperative. This is because governments are forced to pass on increased debt burdens to citizens and companies in form of higher taxes. In fact, in most countries, it is the public sector which is the biggest customer of the banking industry. Workers require salary increases because of inflation, which, as explained, ultimately results from the growing money supply. And inflation also affects the national budget, which is why governments are prone to increase taxes even in the absence of public debt. Now comes the most important point. Even those fortunate companies which have no debt, which do not suffer from government taxes, on whose workers do not ask for pay increases to keep up with inflation, are still not immune to the pressure to expand. And this is because interest is the opportunity cost of any productive investment. The interest rate that banks pay is the benchmark against which the success of any productive investment is measured. Any business that does not generate a profit at least as high as what the business owner could receive by depositing money in a bank account is economically unviable. Hence, interest is the rhythm to which the real productive economy must dance, and not just a fetish as some believe. So on one hand, interest creates a requirement to grow, but on the other, it helps make that growth possible. That is to say, while we just had discussed the growth imperative from a microeconomic or supply side point of view, we can also explain the growth imperative from a macroeconomic or demand side point of view. According to conventional wisdom, lowering interest rate fosters economic growth and vice versa. However, only in the very first moment, lowering interest rates can foster economic growth, while increasing interest rates can slow it down. In the medium and long run, the effect of the interest rate on the money supply works the other way around. And we see a clear positive correlation between interest rates, inflation, and GDP growth rates when looking at the history, for example, as the US economy. That the interest rate and the growth of the money supply, and with it aggregate demand and inflation, are necessarily positively correlated can be understood if we recall that money is the reward for parting with liquidity. The higher the interest rate, the higher the incentive to lend money out or to save it in a bank, which then lends it out for us. Hence, the higher the interest rate, the more easily money circulates in the economy and vice versa, which you can see in this figure. To come back to the above used metaphor of money as the blood of the economy, and interest is the drug that makes the blood circulate. So the more of the drug you apply, the more liquid will be the blood, and the better will be the circulation, and the stronger will be the side effects, such as inflation, price bubbles, and economic crisis. Since economic growth, real GDP growth, means that this year we produce more than the year before, and since the laws of thermodynamics tell us that we cannot produce something out of nothing, a steady GDP growth rate in the long run must end up in increased use of natural resources. And even if we manage to be more efficient and produce the same product or service with less input, it will never be possible to produce a product or service with no input at all. This is why steady economic growth in the long run must cause an increase of the use of natural resources and energy. And even renewable resources will end up overexploited, since if we keep on growing economically, at some point the extraction rate will be higher than the reproduction rate of the resource. And now we can also understand the unemployment problem. If a company is unable to grow, it will typically try to reduce costs in order to maintain the profit at least as high as its opportunity costs, that is to say, the interest rate. Human labor is usually the most significant category of costs, which is why there is a constant pressure to either grow or to replace humans by machines, that is to say, to improve productivity. This is the reason why we see this empirically proven, but nevertheless not well understood dichotomy everywhere, that either the economy grows or unemployment increases. Well, and if the machine gets old, it has to look for a new job too. We can also now understand why our current financial system is a powerful driver behind income inequality, probably the most important driver. As said above, money supply and debt grow in a likewise manner. This means that while on the one side we find ever more monetary units on bank accounts, on the other side, ever more people are ever more indebted. And we can visualize this drawing money supply and debt on the same graph. In this figure here, using data from the US, we can see that monetary assets mirror total debt. And this is no surprise, since, as I just had outlined, there's no interest paying without debt. The gap between the upper and the lower point of this graph is the exponentially growing inequality. The same gap can be observed in any other country if the observed time period is only long enough. And it is not just inequality that grows exponentially and according to a mathematical function, but it can be characterized as an unjust inequality because the one who receives interest does not get rich just thanks to his own effort, but because of the effort of those who borrow money, invest it productively, and pay the interest. This is because money does not work, even though banks might use this metaphor to incentivize clients to invest with them. Nor does it have offspring, as already Aristotle sarcastically had pointed out. It might be that we have honestly gained our money with our own hard work. But if this money is deposited in a bank account and then starts to yield interest, this is only possible because someone else takes a loan and manages with his or her productive investment to pay the interest. Since, as mentioned, there's no interest without debt. Hence, interest can be seen as the right to earn someone else's effort, as Silvio Gesell called it. So we can see there's one cause that explains inflation and price bubbles, growing debtedness, economic crisis, unemployment, the obligation to grow, the destruction of the natural environment connected herewith, and the widening gap between the rich and the poor. So what can we do? How can we make money flow without interest being necessary as a reward for parting with liquidity? And this is the question that occurred to German-Argentine merchant Silvio Gesell 100 years ago. As a solution, he proposed a form of natural money. It is natural money since it does not, as our current form of money does, deviate from nature. Conventional money deviates from nature due to its unnatural or artificial storability. Gesell's natural money, on the contrary, perishes just as real goods do. And to achieve this, tax stamps must be placed on the money bills at set intervals, for example, every 3 months, in order for the bill to be officially accepted. The tax stamps are not supposed to be very expensive, just 1 or 2% of the value of each bill. This hoarding fee, although it is not high, provides a powerful incentive to either spend money, invest it productively, or lend it out. But unlike our current money, this money will not be lent out for interest. Instead, the money owner can be grateful to the borrower, since the borrower promises to pay back the bill with the corresponding stamps are fixed. In other words, since the money perishes in the same manner as real goods do, it cannot be hoarded indefinitely and thus circulates without the necessity for interest as a reward for parting with liquidity. And such money would lose its special position compared to real goods, and money holders could no longer blackmail those in need of money and pressed interest, as Gesell called it, or to exploit the scarcity value of capital, as John Maynard Keynes put it in some smoother words, discussing Gesell's proposal. And this interest-free currency would serve solely as a means to facilitate the exchange of goods and services and not to store wealth. Irving Fisher, the same Irving Fisher which taught us the quantity theory of inflation, considered himself a modest apostle of Silvio Gesell and even wrote a book copying the idea of Gesell, which he called stem strip. Unfortunately, today, students of economics do not have knowledge of this. Also, Keynes, in his main book, The General Theory, he discusses the idea of Silvio Gesell and says that the future will learn more from the spirit of Gesell than from that of Marx. Unfortunately, he was not right in that. And today everyone knows Marx, but almost no one knows Gesell. And at the famous Bretton Woods conference, where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were installed, Keynes proposed an international currency, which he called banker, and which would have applied the idea of Silvio Gesell. Unfortunately, he was not able to get this pushed through. And we have many successful experiments of such natural money. Probably the most successful one is in Wörgl and in Schwanenkirchen in Austria and in Germany. And those cities came out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, applying Silvio Gesell's natural money. Actually, the bill we see here is the bill which circulated in Wörgl for 2 years. And it was so successful in getting the city out of the Great Depression that many other cities started to copy it. And we found it even other countries in Liechtenstein, Switzerland, France, Spain, and even in the US, we had 13 cities which had such natural money experiments. And there was even a bill in the Congress to change the US dollar to a natural money. But at the end, it did not have the majority in Congress. So today, of course, we can think of modern alternatives. We don't have to put stamps on bills. We can think of some electronic banknotes or cash cards, prepaid cash cards, which according to some algorithm apply the according fee. Or even we can think of a negative interest policy by central banks. A negative interest is nothing else as a holding fee. And this idea has been discussed also in working papers by the International Monetary Fund, making expressly citing expressively Silvio Gesell here. In my last book, which you mentioned, Josh, how to fulfill the UN sustainability goals, I also discuss 17 different alternatives. But to summarize, only those concepts can be seen as true alternatives if they come close to the idea of Gesell. That is, to implement some sort of incentive to not hoard, but to make money circulate so that it can serve as the blood of the economy. The proposed monetary reform should be accompanied by a land reform, as also proposed by Silvio Gesell and actually for him, Henry George and John Stuart Mill. This is because land is not subject to decay and has similar superiority over other real goods as money does in our present economic system. A monetary reform as suggested by Gesell without corresponding land reform would lead to people investing in land as a store of value, and after some time, most of the land would end up at the hands of a few, just as today the largest share of our financial assets is held by a relatively small percentage of the population. Here you can see an overview over these three systems: socialism, capitalism, and Gesell's natural economic order. While socialism and capitalism use this current form of money, the unnatural money, they distinguish among each other because in socialism, production factors are in the public hand, and capitalism, production factors are held in private hands. In the natural economic order proposed by Gesell, we have natural money, and also regarding natural resources, land and other natural resources, they are in public hand, while private property exists for man-made goods. So private property for man-made goods, but not for natural resources, land and other natural resources. We could now connect the proposed reform with classical macroeconomics and development planning. We can finally reach so-called perfect competition if we abolish the most important but least recognized reason for market failure, which is the unnatural design of our money. This means we, of course, have to fight courageously monopolies, collusion, unfair competition, and other market failures regarding natural resources. But the most important thing is that we base this on a firm rock, on natural money. And the proposed financial system would abolish the growth imperative. But on the other hand, it would not avert economic growth either if it was necessary for people to develop, here understanding development in the sense of the human scale development approach by Manfred Max Neef et al. In 1991. And according to this concept, the better people can manage to satisfy their fundamental human needs, the more developed is a country or region. Here we see this famous matrix of 9 fundamental human needs in 4 dimensions. and in each cell we put the satisfier we can find in each country or in each region. And the more satisfier we find, the more people are satisfied in their fundamental human needs, the more developed is a region. The roadmap towards more development requires more competition, not less. Manfred Max Neef used to say that he was strongly influenced by Schumacher's opus "Small is Beautiful." Perfect competition is just that. Many small and medium-sized companies competing with each other to best satisfy consumer needs. The best way to fight gigantism, another word that Max Neef used a lot, is to get as close as possible to perfect competition. And perfect competition is finally possible to reach if we reform our monetary system. While today the biggest share of economic growth translates into increasing inequality, in only a relatively small share, if any, promotes development in the sense of promoting the satisfaction of fundamental human needs. But we can argue that with a gazillion natural money, near 100% of economic growth could translate into development, that is to say, into the development in terms of improving the satisfaction of fundamental human needs. Given that the government also successfully enforces competition law, so that also classic market imperfection and monopolistic rents that could derive hereof can be avoided. The driver of economic growth would then solely be the satisfaction of human needs. If by further growth we were not able to improve the satisfaction of human needs, then we would simply not grow anymore, but without that, this economic stagnation would increase, as is the case today, unemployment. So as an overall conclusion, it can be stated that if we aspire an economy that promotes the satisfaction of fundamental human needs, that is a development at human scale, if we want an economy that serves people and not vice versa, and in which gaining money is not an end in itself, if we want a true social ecological transformation that attacks the illness from its root and doesn't just address the symptoms, then we have to reform our money first. This would then provide the basis to establish a truly free market economy. Let us call it a market economy without capitalism, or fair economy. Let me end with some final reflections. Gesell's proposal represents a solution, or at least mitigation, to virtually all the big challenges we face today, especially ever-increasing income inequality and unsustainability of our activities. This, of course, does not mean that a financial system with characteristics like those proposed by Gesell would automatically make all vices disappear. But today, the vices are fostered. It does not mean that any destruction of ecosystems would disappear, but today the destruction is encouraged. In any event, what can be affirmed with complete assurance is that without a reform of our financial system, a sustainable future will not be possible. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Felix. I would say that we are living in a golden age of the awareness of the need for monetary reform. 20, 30 years ago, I would say a negligible number of people was aware of how money even comes into existence. The fact that most money comes into existence through lending by private banks, that it is not the case that the government issues the vast majority of our money. And there's a whole constellation of groups that are arising to address that topic. And this, as you know, this series is a co-production of the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. And Henry George is an advocate of the greenback model of money, which is that money should be issued directly by the government. So my question for you is, to what extent do you believe in making common cause with organizations that embrace that aspect of the critique of the monetary status quo, but do not accept Gesell's analysis of the inherent contradiction between money's functions as medium of exchange and store of value, and thus the need to break those two functions apart. In other words, to make money something that cannot be used as a store of wealth. Do you view it as as a positive path forward to join forces with organizations that embrace part, but not all, of the Gesellian prescription for reforming money?
I believe that joining forces is always good, as long as we make clear what are the differences. But a really joint force between Henry George and Silvio Gesell is the land reform. Also, Silvio Gesell was aware that we need a land reform. If we change our money in the way that it is not hoardable so easily, then most people would be even more than today likely to invest in real estate. And so, in this sense, Henry George and Silvio Gesell go very well in one line. And also the fact that many Georgists, as you say, are also aware of a problem in our monetary system and say that government should issue money. So they also connect here with Gesell. So we have pretty many things in common, actually. But the most important thing, the most important problem, in my understanding, is the contradiction of the two main functions of money, that at the same time it should circulate, but at the same time we use it as a store of value. This cannot work. And this is where interest comes from. Interest is the reward for parting with liquidity. And this is while at the end, financial assets start growing and debt starts growing because there is no interest without debt. So both grow. And this is where income inequality comes from. And at the end, also the obligation to ever grow. So the unsustainability and the inequality, I think this is the two most important problems in the world. They have to do with this contradiction of the two main functions of money.
For sure. Agreed 100%. And the phenomenon of interest is at the heart of this issue. And I'll mention that we have an upcoming episode that Felix will be a part of, in which Felix, Willem Bouter, and Ahmed Anwar are going to have a roundtable conversation on the subject of interest. Because I would argue that if we don't view the subject of interest, if we don't come to a common understanding of the subject of interest, we cannot possibly agree on a solution to the problem. And I would say that's at the heart of the disconnect between Silvio Gesell and Henry George on the subject of money, because they did not agree on why interest exists. So my challenge as someone who has been given the opportunity to talk with and engage with the Georgist community, which is a wonderful opportunity for the Gesellian movement, because Henry George is far better known than Gesell, is that so far I have had limited success convincing Georgists of the Gesellian view of interest. And I have doubts about whether whether it would in fact be a positive development to adopt what you and I, Felix, as supporters of Gesell's view, would consider a partial but incomplete program of monetary reform. In other words, a nationalization of the money creation function, but without demurrage. Because I think, and I suspect that you think also, that that would not solve the problems of increasing wealth inequality, of economic instability, of constant pursuit of growth. And if we were to somehow prevail in that partial, in let's say the Greenback model, the nationalization of money creation, but without demurrage, and it left the problems that we have been discussing in place, would it not discredit the cause of monetary reform? And if that's the case, does that not argue for a sort of all or nothing approach to the subject?
Yeah, I see the problem you try to point out. Maybe that can happen, but I'm still a friend of unite united forces, and not to separate forces.
Yeah, I know about myself that I tend to have an all or nothing mindset, and that can be counterproductive. And so I'm constantly asking myself, is is my personality getting in the way of of building fruitful alliances with people who share some, but not all, of the economic perspective to which I subscribe? Or is it a valid point that pursuing a partial but importantly incomplete program of reform could in fact discredit the whole idea of monetary reform?
Yeah, actually, this is an important point. And also in INVO, in the foundation which I'm the president in Germany, which is the Foundation for Natural Economic Order. So, which the idea is to make known Gesell's proposal. There are many people who are also a friend of a system which they called full reserve money, or which is 100% the 100% money proposal. And many believe then that this alone would cure all the problems. It does not. But fortunately, most of us in the foundation have this, I think, so clear that we need a different kind of money, not just a money which is 100% produced by the public hand, not by private banks.
All right, well, we've got some hands raised, the first of which is someone who I've actually had the debate regarding incrementalism versus wholesale reform. Ed Dodson is a member of the faculty at the Henry George School. Let me bring him on screen.
Well, Josh will be totally surprised that my comment is going to be totally unrelated to that particularly. I simply want to point out that in Henry George's writing on political economy, he always referred to interest as a tangible asset, a portion of the total wealth being produced, and the return to capital, to the owner of capital, to the capital good. So when George talks about that, he would bring up an example like this. I own an electric saw. You have a job of cutting wood. Right now, you only have a hand saw. So I agree to loan you my electric saw to do the work. When you use your hand saw in a given period of time, you could cut 50 boards. I loan you my electric saw in the same amount of time, you cut 100 boards. Is it not appropriate that when you return my electric saw to me, some portion of the 50 extra boards that you were able to cut should be returned to me as interest? And uh, how do you then translate that relationship into a monetary relationship? That's the difficulty.
Yes, and I'm going to toss this to Felix, but I will just point out that what you're describing is implies a theory of interest. You are implying the productivity theory of interest, and that is at odds with the Gesellian and later the Keynesian view of interest, which argue that interest is a consequence of money, not of capital. So let me.
I was just going to say the way to get around that is what has been proposed by some Georgist economists, and that is scrap the term interest to describe what I described and call it capital yield. Then you can use the term interest for the monetary relationships.
Let's throw it to Felix.
Yeah, this is a problem which is maybe here. This is the core problem, which is why Silvio Gesell's economic theory is not really understood well in economics. The example you used is you talked about is chainsaw, right? And if the chainsaw gets better, you have more outcome. The chainsaw is capital. This is real capital. Money is not capital. Money is the medium to exchange to buy capital. Of course, you can rent a machine, and it's just that you receive a reward, which because the machine gets old, you have to maintain it, and you do not usufruct it by yourself. So you need a recompensation for that. But the same argument cannot be applied to money, because money is not a real product with intrinsic value, which usufruct you can postpone or argue that you're not using it. And it's not the same to rent a machine or to rent money. If you take the money, buy the machine, and then rent the machine, then it's just to receive a recompensation for that. It is not just to receive a compensation for a machine which you have not bought yet. Again, money is not capital. Money is a medium from which you can exchange capital or human workforce.
Felix, I think another important part of the answer to Ed's question has to do with the way in which money limits the creation of capital. Ed's question sort of implies the notion of a fixed capital stock, whereas Gesell's analysis tells us that the quantity of capital, which of course is an input to determining the price of capital, is artificially constrained as a result of our form of money. And I don't think that you can answer Ed's point without drawing out the logic of how money impedes the natural process of capital formation.
In other words, what you're saying, Josh, is the element that is not in my scenario is that money has been required in order to produce the equipment, the capital goods that we're making use of, whether it's a hand saw, whether it's electric saw, and everything else that's involved in the production process in our modern world absolutely requires the use of money.
That is true, but that's not the key point that I was driving at. What I was driving at is because of the fact that money, as Felix put it, is an opportunity cost that must be exceeded in order to fund capital creation. That puts a limit on the production of capital. And Gesell's perspective is that that is an artificial phenomenon caused by the existence of interest, and that if interest were not part of the equation, that more resources would go into the creation of more capital, which would drive down the return on capital. And so you made an important distinction, which is, should we change the terminology from interest to capital yield? Capital yield would change if the quantity of capital expanded. Felix, do you want to chime in on that?
No disagreement.
Of course, we need money to exchange, to increase the exchanges of goods and services, and many increases in production and productivity are possible because we have money, and it would be very difficult to barter. And but this does not mean that interest has to exist. We could borrow money and lend money without interest. And in the Silvio Gesellian money system, then this would the credits, the loans would work without interest, and even the increases in productivity of real capital would be better. There would be more increase of productivity than we see today if the loans were interest-free.
All right, well, we've got a bunch of hands raised, so let's go to the next, which is Allison. Let me bring you on screen. Allison, go ahead.
Okay. Shoot. I have too much to ask. One is, thank you, Felix, for your presentation. And is the PowerPoint available to us? Because I get to substitute for our economics class tomorrow and teach about heterodox economics. I have a free platform. So my big mission has been to bring this into earlier and earlier education, because it's a fundamental shift in paradigm, right? And so that's the first one.
Felix, is there a way that you can share your PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I'm happy to share my slides, of course.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you brought up Max Neef. And one of the ways that I've approached teaching both the natural order column that you have is also what as I see it, as understand. Yes. So that's how I've approached teaching. It's a kind of a biomimicry, perhaps, like approach to that. And looking at, but also with the human needs. And so I feel like addressing the human needs and recognizing at each step which economic strategy that's taking place is trying to address which human need. And when we do that, I think we open up more opportunities to design better strategies to assure that need. The need, of course, with the chainsaw example, I like that a lot. And I guess one of the things I imagine is ultimately that's just an agreement that's happening between these two parties. And the interest is one strategy for that agreement, but it's simply, I'm going to borrow this chainsaw, and in return, I'm going to soup it up, make it even better than it was before, make sure it's oiled and kept clean, kind of the Gesellian Robinson Crusoe model. It's better than just sitting in the shed rusting. And then afterwards, I return it to you with X amount of money. It's just an agreement for that particular use. Surely if he's producing that much more wood, he would buy his own chainsaw, right?
And
So
also the chainsaw, if you rent a chainsaw, this is not interest. This is renting a
that's
machine.
right. That's right. Exactly. It's very simple.
Interest is
It's
you
very-
rent money. If
So I
you're
don't even, yeah, it was a little complicated, even the suggestion of capital, whatever. Just it's an agreement that we're making, we're renting it. And it's a very salient point, the most important point is this money being infrastructure. That's that is an accounting measure, simply an accounting measure upon who's doing what, when, and how. Where I think a lot of people get hung up is foreseeing the solutions when we've been taught, and it's ingrained in us that, and more and more, we're getting to see access to future security. So that I fear I'm going to talk too much, but in addition to Max Neef, there's another model of human need that's called salutogenesis. And there are three human needs that I think reflect very well, what money is doing, basically. It's the need to have meaning and purpose in life, or entrepreneurship, right? Recognizing value. There's the need to have manageable life. I get to meet my needs every day. That is the fluidity and liquidity of money. And the need to have some future security. And of course, that's the store of value. And those are the three basic fundamental needs. We don't go into all of the other stuff, right? That's the core to us. And so when it comes into that future security, it hits on a amygdala level, right? And so immediately there's a lot of resistance to a monetary design that is decreasing in value and or government owning land when it's the closest access that any average individual has to assuring future security is the ownership of land. And I think addressing those things and showing, like I think the original Landlord's Game did very well, of showing how if we play along at these certain set of rules, we actually build up future security in a better way than we're doing now, as in the center of the Sustainable Development Goals, economic growth is the actual cause of all of the other problems around it that it's trying to address. And so I think my question is, how can we express to an audience a future security model of money for those who can no longer work, and retirement? So I kind of see that the Gesellian model is like a modern monetary theory, perhaps, where, we finance people who are good for their promises, who are making a promise or a commitment, and we finance them, and that's the banking part, and give them what is that accounting measure that circulates, and it continues to go back. So even if it's demurrage, it's pulling back into the general fund, so to speak. And as our capacity grows, that amount to be able to lend out and finance grows. So we don't really have to put money aside at all. We just need to be able to have access to that liquidity. And that makes sense to me until someone's not able to work anymore, right? And all of those other things, and how to finance with the natural economic order some of those social needs that, healthcare and all kinds of things. I'll take it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, you're addressing a problem that I hear a lot. How can we finance our retirement in the Gesellian system? Well, the answer is exactly in the same way as today. You can have money in a bank, and in a Gesellian system, if you have money in a bank and say to the bank, take my money for 5 years, lend it to someone else, then you would not have this hoarding fee applied. Money would then not lose. You can also save money in a bank and Gesellian system, as today. You will not receive interest, but you would not need interest because inflation wouldn't exist. And also, as today, you can invest somewhere, you can buy stocks, you can buy land in this, Well, and it depends how we do the Gesell system, but um, I'm also not a fan to really. I'm not really sure if we really should do this thing with the that land is completely state-owned. If it's not, you can buy land, you can buy stocks, whatever. Well, and even if we do the complete natural economic order where land is stately owned and you just rent the land, but even then you can invest in your house because your house will be, even in the system, in the Galilean system, will keep your house, and the people who live there, and if they die, their offspring has the right to keep on this land. Yes, you would have to pay a rent, but today we have to pay taxes, and there wouldn't be more than the taxes we have to pay on our real estate.
All right. We've got more hands, but before we bring in the next person, I'd like to respond also to something that Allison said, which I think related to the previous question, which has to do with the productivity theory of interest. Allison pointed out that the lender of the chainsaw benefits through lending because the alternative is that the chainsaw sits in the shed and rusts and loses value, and that by lending the chainsaw, that is a way of insulating the lender from the forces of nature, which apply to virtually all forms of real capital. So again, I think it is so important to engage with the productivity theory of interest that Ed voiced, because he's correct that the person who is in a position to provide labor with capital and thereby increase the productivity of labor is benefiting labor. But that's only half of the picture. The lender of the capital is also benefiting from that transaction. It's a win-win it's a win-win dynamic, and the productivity theory of interest only compensates one side of that win-win dynamic. It compensates the provider of capital, and it does not take into account that the owner of capital is also benefiting. And that's what Silvio Gesell's Robinson Crusoe story is designed to illustrate. Felix, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and renting the chainsaw against money, this is not interest, it's a rent for a real product. Interest is if you rent money, but here they rent a real product. This is not interest. This is all in all this theory, they confuse or mix up interest with real economic profits. Interest is if you gain money for lending money. This is the problem. The problem is not, no, it's not if you rent a chainsaw and receive money against it. This is not a moral problem, and it's also not an economic problem. Only one, from the one hand, flows the money to the person who rents the chainsaw. But interest makes deposits grow, and debt in likewise manner. New monetary units are produced by interest, because if interest is paid on some bank account, where does the money come from if the central bank has not produced more money? The answer is only from a new loan, which is also interest-bearing. Yeah. This is where both start growing, money supply and debt, and they start to decouple from the real economy. This is the problem. The problem is if you rent money against interest. The problem is not if you rent machines against money.
All right.
This is not well distinguished, because in our economic theory, we mix up interest with capital. We define with capital gains. We define money as capital. Even today, if we talk of capital, we mean money. Capital is a production factor. Money is not a production factor. Money is a medium to buy a production factor.
All right. Howard Switzer is up next. Howard, go ahead.
Right. Well, I have a slightly different take on the rent, because and I understand your arguments, which I think are also true and important. So I suppose two things can be true at once. But interest is built into rent in this current system. A fellow German, Margaret Kennedy, did the research.
Yes.
And came up that on average, 50% of the prices we pay for all the goods and services is interest. And so if you're renting, there's interest built into that, embedded into that cost. Now, even a person who lends his chainsaw out, he may want to ask for enough to cover maintenance on the use of it. But there's also that other factor of just relationship, community relationship, and wanting to make everybody, everything work good. There's that aspect to it. But I also wanted to talk about the banks, how in monetary reform, we're saying that the banks can still exist. They just can't create money. They have to lend money that's already been issued into the economy by the government and for public purpose, for the common good, not into speculation and all that kind of stuff. And so that is a vast improvement over what we have. Now, of course, we have these huge accumulations of money, which is power, to deal with still. And I see demurrage as a next step to say, okay, this is how we battle with that. And if we can include that all in one thing, that's pretty good, because that's a question I get about monetary reform. How are we going to deal with the current accumulations of money? And so I think we've touched on the two most important principles. It has to be publicly issued, and it should be a better circulation medium by adding demurrage. So I didn't really have a question. I just had those comments.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Howard. If I can, before the next question, I want to read a quick passage from Gesell that I think is key to understanding this point that is, in my opinion, so critical and so hard to wrap your head around, which is the connection between money and capital. So let me just quickly read this passage. Gesell writes, "So-called real capital is therefore anything rather than real. Money alone is true real capital, basic capital. All other capital objects are completely dependent upon the characteristics of the existing form of money. They are its creatures. They received the title of nobility, the title of capital from money. Deprive money of the privilege of forbidding the workers to build new houses. Tear down the barrier raised by money between the workers and real capital, and the supply of such things will increase until they lose the characteristics of capital." That passage, to me, encapsulates the connection between money and capital, and the reason why capital yield, the concept of capital yield that Ed shared, does not fully address the point, because the supply and demand of capital would be fundamentally different with a natural form of money. And so as Gesell tells us that capital yield, if money was no longer an artificial barrier to the natural creation of capital, then the capital yield and interest would both decline toward or all the way to zero. Felix, do you want to comment on that before we go on to our next question?
If the money was naturally not storable, automatically the interest would decline to zero. Yes.
And
Can you
capital
repeat that?
yield also would decline because the supply of capital would increase, driving down the return on capital.
At least we would not have this obligation to grow anymore. And since no one wants to move if it doesn't have to move. We're not trying to grow because we're greedy, because we have this opportunity costs behind us. Interest is the opportunity cost of any productive investment. And this is why we have to at least as fast as interest growth in the same rhythm. If interest is on zero, we would not have this obligation to grow. And since we are lazy, we will not grow anymore. Today, this is not possible. Today, in today's world, we do not grow, we will produce unemployment. This is because we have to yield at least a profit which would gain on a bank account, right? And if we cannot grow, then we have to save up costs somewhere else. And usually, human workforce is the most important cost category. Today, in today's world, if we do not grow, we will cause unemployment. But in a Gesellian monetary system where interest goes to zero because money is not storable, we would not have this pressure to grow or to save up costs somewhere else. That means we would not grow anymore. At least not if we are already well off. Maybe in some countries where people lack the satisfaction of fundamental human needs, yeah, they might grow because they need to produce more products to be able to fulfill the fundamental human needs. But if we already have fulfilled them, then there would be no need to grow. In today's economy, everyone has to grow. Even countries like the US or European countries where people live well, we have to grow. Otherwise, they will produce unemployment. And this dichotomy to either grow or otherwise we see unemployment comes from our interest rate, interest on money, which is the benchmark against which each productive investment has to be measured. So if this goes to zero, yes, then probably capital returns would also come close to zero. But because we have not this pressure to grow anymore.
All right, next question. Let's bring in the money apprentice.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Henry George School, Felix, Josh, very, very important, interesting points that we're talking about here now, trying to advance to a new monetary system. That's how I look at it. But there's one thing that I feel like is not being said, and I want to say, and I want the other aspect of government issue money. When government issues money, it's permanent money. Greenbacks were permanent. They stayed in circulation until Bill Clinton, said you can't renew them anymore. So all that money that was created as greenbacks, that 450 million, stayed in circulation throughout the economy for all those years. It was all there. It was $1 every day, okay? So the difference between private debt-based bank-issued money and public debt-free issue of permanent money cannot be overstated, So when we think about money, we have to think about it in terms of what happens if you have permanent money. Well, if people don't realize that the fact that when you have private debt-based money, all the money in circulation is constantly generating an interest burden onto the population, okay, onto the civilians that are using the money system users. And that can go a long ways to replace that with debt-free money, like as the monetary reformers are advocating through the Kucinich bill now, the bill of Kucinich and the American Monetary Institute. It's issued all the money that becomes permanent. All the money that's going to be circulating in the economy, becomes permanent. Okay, you don't have the money that's paid off, that's destroying the money supply, be renewed. It doesn't have to be renewed. It never has to be renewed. This is an important factor. So as we go to making 21st century solutions to the money problem, and my respect for Gesell is magnified, as much as it can be, but still he was dealing with real paper currency. And because he was dealing with paper currency, we were doing the demurrage aspects of it correctly. But if you remove the need to have interest on money being issued, then you take a huge burden that we're all talking about, and it's the one that causes the inequality. It's the one that causes the I'm not going to say the inflation, but it's the one that causes the unemployment. Because as we use today's money system, which, you remember what they called it? The elastic money system, the one that increases and decreases by demand. Imagine that you wanted to have a monetary system, the means of exchange for the economy, be something that's going to increase and decrease. No, you want the money system to be permanent. You can have credit that increases and decreases, but if you take money out of the economy by destroying it when you pay back a loan, no, then that has to have new money that's issued with more debt, and the money, the multiplier of the interest, the curve of the interest accelerates. So we won't have that. And I just think that that's an important concept that we need to keep in mind with regard to it. As we try to strive for a new monetary system, to me, the most important thing is a permanent money system, and a permanent money system that's issued debt-free, so that all money that's circulating in the economy does not have any interest associated with it. However, when that money becomes credit, when that money becomes the money that the banks are going to now be able to lend out, as Fisher was saying, then that money will be lent out at interest, but the interest, the incentive for interest, okay, the incentive for interest is going to go from up here, where it's in the hands of the financialists and the speculators, is going to come down here to the people who are going to be putting their money in banks that are going to be lending according to their policy beliefs. Okay, so we have to think of these things as with new ways of looking at it, not just the demurrage aspect of it. And how do you do demurrage when you have permanent money that's issued by the government without any debt? I think that's an important concept to keep in mind. Now, the last thing that I want to mention, because we talk about sustainability and how important that is to everybody, and I totally agree. Of course, I was a member of the International Institute for Ecological Economics for 12 years. And there, Sadi's work is just kind of like, the real gold of that system. So how do we do that? Well, I have here, everybody knows For the Common Good, which was Daly's publication, but it wasn't until the second printing that he got to add his afterword. Money, debt, and wealth. There's no money, debt, and wealth anywhere in an economic model that anybody learns in school. Okay? When we talk about the fact that we don't learn about money in school, we don't learn about money and debt and wealth and the interactions there. But if you read this paper introduces the importance of really the work of Sadi and the introduction of ecological economics to the work that we have to also keep in mind. So with that, what I'm going to say is we need new ways of assuring that we do away with the inequality, that we do away with the unsustainability, new ways of doing that are beyond what some of the things that we're talking about today. And I thank you very much for everybody for their contributions here. Sorry for taking so long. Over.
I'd like to comment on the permanent money point, which I think is a very critical point, but I'd like to let Felix go first in response to that. Felix?
Yeah. Even if the government produced the money and not the banks, if the money is hoardable, then it would not circulate well in the economy. Interest will still exist. The problems will not disappear. And if the government lends money without interest, then they would have to do that constantly. People would hoard their money under the mattress, not flow. The government constantly would have to issue more money to compensate for people hoarding money under the mattress, and we will have a huge money supply, this time not created by interest, but
Totally false. Totally false.
Let me-
I'll do that personally with Felix. I'd like to approach this personally with Felix. It's okay.
Sure. Let me respond to the point about permanent money, because I think that gets to the heart of the issue here. You pointed out that greenbacks were issued in the mid 1800s and existed 100 years later. Did a single piece of productive capital that was produced in the mid 1800s still exist in the mid 1900s? Probably not. And it is that disconnect between the nature of money and the nature of capital which is the heart of the problem. If money is meant to be a neutral medium for the exchange of real wealth, then it needs to share the same physical properties as the wealth that it is used to exchange. And permanent money cannot function as a neutral medium for the exchange of capital, which is not permanent. Capital by its physical nature is not permanent. So permanent money, according to Gesell's view, can never function as a neutral medium of exchange. Anyway, we've got a
Wait,
lot.
I don't understand. Didn't it serve for 150 years as a permanent means of exchange?
Yes, but
Okay, so then how could you say that?
Because it was functioning as a medium of exchange, but not as a neutral medium of exchange. It is the non-neutrality is what gives rise to interest, and interest is what causes wealth to flow in a pathological way.
maybe you can see it this way. There is no such thing as positive money, as some believe. Money, if I put it in a bank account, even if we came back to gold coins, if I put it in a bank account, for me it is an asset, for the bank as a liability. Money is always the counterpart of debt. This is not possible to avoid. Also, if the government produces money, in the central bank, it's in the counterpart of debt.
Central
If I have
bank,
money,
government.
put it on a bank account, it's for me an asset, for the bank, it's a liability. The problem is not that money is the counterpart of debt. This is not possible to avoid. The problem is that both increase because of interest, and interest exists because it's hoardable. I've discussed this in detail in this book. The whole book is about this. I recommend it to read this. The whole book is about this topic. What's money?
I agree with the point that you were making about you need a new money system to solve the sustainability problems, and especially climate change. Okay, but there has to be, to me, I'll be honest with you. If it's not debt-free money, it's not going to be able to do any of that. Over, and that's over. I'm probably sorry.
Yeah, the point is that there is no money which is not debt. If I have a coin, then this is an asset, right?
Wait a second. Were greenbacks debt?
Yes,
Yes.
Oh, who said yes?
Allison.
Allison. They were debts. They were debts to whom?
The soldiers, the families, they were the way to pay for the Civil War. It was, the government.
Money is what you
debt.
use. Money is what you use to replace debt. Okay, so rather than have the banks lend the money to the government pay interest on the money, and then either lend it or pay it to the soldiers, the government issued the money without debt and paid it to the soldiers, and that money continued to circulate without debt for 150 years.
Without interest. Without interest. I mean,
without interest.
Without
Yeah.
interest. I agree. And I love the greenbacks, and I worked on public banking for a long time. And I think that's a wonderful way to go. I think that one of the things I didn't mention, sorry to jump in, is just a monetary ecosystem, because I think it is valuable to have a yes, and there could be different types of money growing and spreading around in different ways. But I think that the goal is to have the money come back to its source and issue more money as needed. And that's a way to balance the quantity of contracts which I'm going to say contracts instead of money because it's confusing on what money is. So, so the quantity of these accountability contracts circulating that match the goods and services needed in the community. And so there's parity there. And when it's not matching, because it's circulating forever, and it's harder to keep track of how much is out there, we could have inflation and deflation. So I just think there's yes and lots of different ways to kind of look at it. But I agree with Felix and Josh.
Yeah, I want to move on to the next question. I'd like to just acknowledge what a complex subject we're all grappling with is, and we're not going to resolve it today. This is a subject that I think all four of us and everyone else who is participating in this conversation has probably been struggling with for years or decades. And this is precisely why I thought that the subject of interest would be a great topic for a roundtable where we bring together experts who have different views. Because if we don't, in my view, if we don't come together on the topic of interest, why interest exists, then we will never agree on the correct design of money. And it is important to acknowledge that Silvio Gesell and Henry George had different understandings of why interest exists. So it is natural and inevitable that they will not see eye to eye on the correct design of money. The only way that we're ever going to get on the same page about the correct design of money is if we first arrive at a common understanding of the phenomenon of interest. And we're not there yet. It's an enormously complex topic, and I think we just need to hold that complexity and difficulty and accept that it's going to take time for any of us to fully digest it. So having said that, let me bring in the next raised hand. Matthias Klimpel, you've got your hand raised. Yeah, there you go. Let's see. Matthias, welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Yeah, I'm a colleague of Felix from Invo. I'm also on the Invo board, so as the vice CEO. And yeah, I want come back to the example with the chainsaw, and I find it a very interesting example, since I feel that it's intended to justify interest stemming from the real capital. In fact, this example has parallels to Gesell's explanation of the interest as a pure monetary phenomenon. So if you have on the one side the chainsaw, you can ask not only if it's okay to lease or rent the chainsaw, it's a question, how huge is the lease rate? Is it enough to replace the appreciation and the risk premium and the wage of the borrower, yeah? Or takes it all the products the other is producing with it? It's a huge difference to take all the added value or only the replacement cost. And the example of the chainsaw, this example did not address this question. How huge is the lease rate? Is it at maximum? So the borrower of the chainsaw, all added value belongs to me, then I can just say it's exploitation. Or is it for free? And even the replacement costs are not paid. So the lease rate is zero. Then the borrower bears cost. It's a reverse exploitation. The leasing of the chainsaw without any compensation is exploitation from the other side. So if the market economy works well, so we have to address who belongs to land and so on, but you have the compensation, or the market should tend, if it works well, the market, in theory, to equal wages, or respectively to the labor done, and so includes a risk premium, but it's not an outcome of an efficient market, that the whole added value is taken on by the owner of the chainsaw. So this example leaves a huge range with the question, how huge is the compensation for the chainsaw? What's the lease rate? And if you look at Gesell's explanation for the interest, and from my point of view, the most not only important chapter, but it's just some sentences of Gesell's work, which are the most important, and I add, are even not understood within the Gesellian community. And it's possible so to think about this for more than years. It is in the famous fifth part, in part 5.2, in English it's called the basic interest, and it's not at the beginning. Yeah, some sides down. So Gesell writes, there is even at the present day a general opinion that the rise or fall of interest is determined by competition among those who lend money. And here it's an important point. He says, so, be clear, the implicit or explicit assumption is there is competition between moneylenders. And Gesell says, this opinion is wrong. There is no such thing as competition between moneylenders. He makes up, and he explains, competition is here an impossibility. If the money offered or loaned by capitalists is drawn from the existing circulation, so he has a model in mind of a constant amount of money, which is not like our monetary system looks, but which is necessary to understand the nature of money. You can't start with a complicated monetary system today without having an idea how it works in a more simple way. You have to understand, or you can only understand the monetary system with the central bank function today. From my point of view, if you look at Gesell's model with a constant money, then you can only understand what central banks really do. The central bank really does. And so he has in mind for his general approach a constant sum of money. Yeah. So if the money offered for loan by capitalists is drawn from the existing circulation, the capitalists, by lending this money, merely fill the holes they have dug by withdrawing it. 10, 100, or 1,000 moneylenders mean 10, 100, or 1,000 holes dug by these moneylenders in the path that money has to pursue. The greater the amount of money, of loan money offered, the greater are these holes. It's very difficult to understand, and it's worth thinking about, and it's theoretically, because you have to abstract from the current system where the central bank provides an infinity elasticity of money, only depending on the interest rate. But you can only understand what central banks are doing if you understand the sentence. And it explains not only the interest, it explains also the power of the central banks today. If you look at the facts, no private bank really influences interest rates. The central banks are setting the interest rates and influence them. And it's just because of this argument Gesell provides. And you can see on this example, if you have a chainsaw which can be reproduced, the lease rate will tend to the production cost plus risk premium. If you think in this world in this theoretically world of the constant money, you see there is no reproduction, there is no competition between money lenders. The interest rates raises up to the top. So, to speak in the neo-Ricardian view, it's a maximum profit possible, which is the first point of truth. What money is doing is to say, without my money, you can barter. If I provide you money, you don't need to barter. You can use money. You are more efficient in the exchange process. So give me the whole added value, money, in form of reducing transaction costs, in form of avoiding barter. Yeah, this advantage of money, pay me for that. And I get the most. That you are so Gesell is much more than just say there's a liquidity premium, which is a small part of the theory. The main part is that the interest is a result of money reducing transaction cost, avoiding barter. That money use is more efficient than barter, and the money lender can come and say, pay me for that. I take the added value of that, so to my pocket. And this is so it's not really simple, but this is an analytical breakdown of the Gesellian theory. And if you look at this, you will see, oh, it's the same structure as the differential rent of Ricardo or Henry George. It's an application of the differential rent theory or approach. It's a special form of the different rent. So Gesell is in effect just an extension of the differential rent thinking to the monetary system, not just for land and resources, but also for such limited things as money. I know it's complicated, and I just can propose, look at this article and try to understand what wants it to say. But it's not easy, because you have to assume something, so the constant amount of money, which is not given today. But I can say you can only understand the money, the elasticity of money implicit now in systems, which is a political decision, and elasticity only due to the central banks. All talk about private banks, but they do not influence interest rates, only central banks. And here's this is so.
All right. Thank you, Matthias. Felix, do you want to comment before I move on to the next question?
Yes, thank you, Matthias, for your explanation. But to resume it, the interest comes from the hoardability of money as a reward for parting with liquidity, as Keynes called it. And Gesell called it the basic interest, which exists there because the money is hoardable and not because of market constellations.
This is all a great commercial for our future roundtable on interest, which I will mention the date of. That's going to be on October 21st. As I've mentioned, that will be with Felix, Willem Bouter, and Ahmed Anwar to continue hashing out this fascinating and critically important subject. All right. Ed Dodson is coming back for round two.
Well, Josh, was so long ago, my immediate reason for raising my hand again was to respond to your comment about what I said, but now I can't remember exactly what your comment was. Although, what I wanted to say was, I think that the relationship between capital yield And the scenario that I painted is a little bit more nuanced than you seem to think. And the reason I say that is because there's depreciation in use and there is depreciation with non-use. And for different types of assets, the rate of depreciation is much greater for non-use than use. Things wear out faster from non-use. Now we're getting into this world where we have capital goods that are producing capital goods without any new infusion of very much labor. So robots producing capital goods, and then other robots producing or repairing the robots that are producing the capital goods. So one of the things that the previous speaker mentioned was that the competitive markets will determine what the appropriate capital yield will be. And then the producer of the capital good will have to determine is what the market is going to offer me as a yield for my efforts worth me to produce things. And I just wonder what the future is going to look like with that scenario and how the Gesellian solution to the money problem will affect that particular set of circumstances.
Felix, got anything?
Again, there's this thing we have to define what is money and what is capital. Money is not a production factor. I once heard a similar explanation of the problem as you said with the chainsaw. Someone said at former times there was a farmer who needed a plow, and there was the soldier who made the plow. And so they agreed upon the farmer rented the plow from the soldier who made the plow, and he paid him with potatoes he got out of his plants. He planted potatoes and then he paid him with potatoes, or sold the potatoes and the money he gave to the soldier for renting him, leasing him the plow. So the argument was in the former times also interest existed. And thanks to the interest, they could interchange and both were able to gain something. But the thing is, it was not interest, it was renting or leasing a real good. In today's world, the thing works the other way around. You have to first go to the bank, lease money, and with the money, you can lease the plow. In today's world, you pay twice. You pay the lease of the plow and the lease of the money. And this is actually a thing which Saint Thomas Aquino had already discussed about. And we don't see this because we define money as capital. And so we compare real economic gains with gains from money lending. And we have to clearly define or distinguish these two things. And then things come more clear. Actually, in this book, I have a whole chapter on this, chapter 9. It's one of the thickest chapters in this book, actually, about the interest theories and if they hold or not.
Ed, anything further?
I don't, not at this point. I think if I read Felix's book, perhaps I'd be able to come back with some intelligent questions. But I'm just trying to picture what the future of the world will look like, and I'm not yet clear on that aspects of what. I'll add this. I think as a local currency experiment to merge will work perfectly. Can it work on an extended experiment to a national or international economy? That's, I guess, my question now that needs to be fleshed out.
I believe yes. Can I answer? Yeah, I believe that it would. Actually, that would be wonderful. Unfortunately, Virgil was only a small experiment. It would be a lot better to have a whole country. And the future would look lots more prospectful if we had a Silvio Gesellian monetary system in each country, probably. In the current system, if we don't change it, the future doesn't look really good, in my opinion. We see wars coming up, and they have to do not only with crazy politicians, but also with the need to grow and the need to capture resources.
So, final question then, are we doomed to collapse before the solutions will actually be even tried? Is our wisdom so flawed that we have to wait until we get to the very bottom before we
Hopefully.
actually think of good ideas to implement?
I don't have a
Shaking your
crystal
head
ball.
as though you agree with me on that.
My crystal ball doesn't work anymore. I throw it away. It doesn't work. But most probably, we will not change the system before it collapses.
That's been
Unfortunately,
a common belief on the part of past guests on this show, starting with the very first, which was Steve Keen. He made a very grim prediction in which he said he thought maybe 10% of the human population will survive the catastrophes which are headed our way. Obviously, I hope he's wrong. But I think what this all highlights is that theoretical argumentation is one thing. It's worthwhile, it's interesting, and we can learn from it. But I think it is very limited as well. And at some point, we need to put different models into practice and observe real results, because it could very well be the fact that two people debate a subject and one just happens to be better at debating than the other one. That doesn't mean that that person that person's views are the right ones. You know, the dynamics of debate are very complex too, and ultimately economics is about real people, real matter, real goods and services, and Felix, as you say, fulfilling human needs. And I think that the proof is ultimately in the pudding. You need to see how different models perform in terms of fulfilling human needs. And no amount of theory is going to definitively settle that question. At some point, I think you need to put competing models into motion and see how they perform. Any thoughts on that? No? All right. Well, that just about brings us up to the 2-hour mark. There's a lot that we didn't even get a chance to discuss, and that's fine. I don't view the purpose of Economy 2.0 to settle any questions in a 2-hour time frame. Rather, I view Felix as someone who has been introduced into the conversation today. He will be back with us on October 21st as a part of the roundtable. He will perhaps be back for future episodes in which we can discuss other aspects of his work, which we didn't have an opportunity to get to today. So Felix, before we end, do you want to tell the audience where they can find you, where they can find your work, how they can connect with you?
yeah, you can find me in Valdivia, in Chile, in the Universidad Austral de Chile, and I can put my email address here in the chat, so you can contact me. I put it here. Also,
Felix, you can send me any links that you want to your book, to your university, to your website, and I will put them in the description section of the YouTube video.
yes, and if you Google me, you can find my webpage, fuders.cl, and you could find any of my publications, my books and papers accessible there. Thank
All
you
right.
very much for your time. I was happy to be here with you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Felix. And we will see you again at the roundtable episode on October 21st. And thanks to everyone for joining us. We will see you in a couple of weeks.